Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into some more fascinating tax talk. Today,
Yeah.
we're going to tackle a big one.
Mm-hmm.
The Goods and Services Tax / Harmonized Sales Tax.
GST, HST.
Or as everyone just calls it, GST, HST.
You got it.
Now, we've got this pretty hefty government document as our guide today.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically like the handbook for businesses
Yeah,
dealing with GST, HST.
it is.
So by the end of this deep dive,
Right.
you'll know the basics of GST, HST,
Right.
whether you even need to register for it,
Yep.
and how to use key concepts
Mm-hmm.
like input tax credits.
Oh, yeah. Input tax credits are
To your advantage.
absolutely huge for businesses to understand this.
Yeah. So,
It's amazing how many people I've talked to who find taxes just so intimidating.
okay.
But you know what?
Yeah.
Once you break it down and
Right.
understand like the language,
Uh-huh.
it's much easier to see how it applies to you.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and speaking of language,
Mm.
this document we're looking at
Yeah.
starts with a whole section of definition.
Sure does.
I guess in the tax world,
Oh, yeah.
words really do matter.
Absolutely, they do. A slight misinterpretation
Right.
can lead to
Right.
big consequences.
Yeah.
For example, the definition of commercial activity
Okay.
might surprise you.
Okay.
It's not just about running a traditional business.
Right.
Even a one-time sale of
Yeah.
real estate
Mhm.
can count as a commercial activity.
So someone selling their house
Exactly.
might need to think about GST, HST.
Yeah, you might be surprised.
That's something I wouldn't have considered.
Yeah, and the document highlights some specific exceptions to that, like
Yeah.
the small supplier rule.
Okay.
If your revenue is below a certain amount,
Right.
you might not need to register.
Gotcha.
But understanding that threshold is key.
So revenue is a big factor
Yes,
in determining who needs to register.
absolutely.
What about those listed financial institutions? I saw mentioned. It's not just banks.
Yeah, it's not just banks.
Oh.
No, it includes trust companies
Okay.
and even businesses that are primarily involved in lending money.
Interesting.
So these institutions have very specific rules that they have to follow. And so
Right.
the detailed list that's actually in the guide
Right.
is really important.
Yeah. So it seems like knowing these definitions
It
is the first step
Yeah.
to figuring out
Absolutely.
if and how GST, HFT applies to you.
You got it. And actually, the document is very, very clear about who must register
Okay.
anyone making taxable supplies
Okay.
in the course of a commercial activity.
Go. Hold on. Taxable supplies.
Yeah.
Is that just a fancy way?
Kind of, but
What is
not
that?
quite.
That-
It
yeah.
refers to goods and services
Got
that
it.
are subject to GST, HST.
Mm-hmm.
There are very specific criteria that are
Yeah.
outlined in the document,
All right.
but in very simple terms. It's most of the things that businesses sell.
Okay. So if you're selling taxable supplies
Right.
as part of your business,
Mm-hmm.
you likely
You like...
don't need to register for GST, HST.
Yes, but I'm guessing you're going to ask me about...
But I'm guessing
Things.
there are exceptions.
There are?
There are.
Yeah.
For example, if you're a small supplier,
Okay.
meaning your revenue falls below
Right.
a specific threshold,
Okay.
you generally
yeah.
don't have to register.
Right.
However, there are exceptions to that,
Of course.
like taxi and ride-sharing businesses.
Okay.
They're required to register.
Regardless of their
Revenue. So even if your revenue is low,
Yes.
there might be other factors
Yeah.
that require you to register.
Absolutely.
Makes sense. But what if you don't
Yeah.
have to register?
That's a great question.
Is there ever a reason to do it anyway?
There can be. Even if registration isn't mandatory,
Okay.
it can be strategically advantageous because of something called
Okay.
input tax credits
Okay.
or ITCs.
ITCs, that sounds
Yeah.
familiar.
Mm.
Could you refresh my memory on how
Sure.
those work?
Absolutely. When you're registered for GST, HST,
Okay.
you can actually claim ITCs
Okay.
to recover the GST, HST
Okay, yeah.
you paid on business expenses.
Okay.
So while registering might seem like a burden,
Right.
it could actually save you money.
So it's like getting a rebate
Yes.
on the taxes you paid
Exactly.
for things your business needs.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. I'm starting to see why understanding this is so important.
Absolutely.
Now, is there anything else in this document
Oh, there's tons.
that might surprise someone new
Yeah.
to the world of GST, HST?
There are definitely some interesting sections.
Oh,
One
boy.
that stands out to me is about cryptocurrency mining.
Cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
That's definitely a hot topic these days.
It is a hot topic.
What's the key takeaway there?
Generally, if you're mining crypto
Mm-hmm.
and receiving payment for it,
Okay.
it's not considered a
Right.
taxable supply.
So no GST, HST headaches
Not in that specific scenario.
for crypto miners,
Exactly.
at least in that scenario.
Right.
Fascinating. I also noticed a section about taxes
Yes.
specific to First Nations.
Yeah.
That's not something you see in every tax guide.
No, it's not. It really highlights the complexities of the Canadian tax system,
Right.
particularly when you're considering Indigenous rights and self-governance.
Yeah.
So the document talks about
Okay.
the FNGST,
Okay.
the First Nations Goods and Services Tax,
Okay.
and the FNT, the
Mhm.
First Nations Tax.
Okay.
Both of those are administered by the CRA
Oh.
on behalf of specific First Nations or Indigenous governments.
So there's a separate system for certain First Nations.
Yes, there is.
What's important for someone to know about that?
The document actually lists specific dates
Okay.
when the FNGST ceased to apply
Okay.
on various First Nations lands.
Interesting.
For example, on Manoff lands of several First Nations,
Hmm.
it stopped applying in November 2023,
Okay.
and for Nizia lands
Mhm.
in January 2024.
Okay.
This means that the regular GST-HST
Right.
now applies in those areas.
Gotcha.
So if you're doing business on or near First Nations land,
Right.
you really need to be aware of these changes
Yeah.
to avoid any potential tax issues.
So even something as straightforward as location
Exactly.
can have a big impact
Abs-
on how GST, HST is applied.
It can.
That's something I'll definitely keep
Yeah.
in mind.
Good.
Now, this document is pretty hefty.
It is.
What else should we
Lots to unpack.
be focusing on in this deep dive?
Well, we've talked about who needs to register
Right.
and the benefits of ITCs,
Mm-hmm.
but there's still a lot more to unpack.
Okay.
One area that often causes confusion is price adjustments,
Yeah.
discounts, rebates,
Right.
trade-ins.
Mhm.
They all impact
Yeah.
how you calculate GST, HST.
Okay. Let's unpack that in our next segment.
Sounds good.
It sounds like
Yeah.
there's some hidden complexities there
Oh, yeah,
that could easily trip someone up.
absolutely. So let's dive into those price adjustments.
Yep.
Getting them right is
Mhm.
crucial
Right.
for calculating the correct GST, HST.
Mm.
Even a small error can mean overpaying or underpaying tax,
Yeah.
and neither of those are ideal.
No. So where do we start?
Well,
This document seems to cover
yeah,
a lot of different scenarios.
it does. One common one is
Right.
early payment discounts.
Oh.
Even if a customer pays early and gets the discount,
Right.
you still charge GST, HST on the full invoice amount.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So it's like the discount doesn't even exist
Kind of.
for tax purposes.
Yeah, in a way, yes.
Okay.
The idea is to maintain consistency and avoid any potential for manipulation.
Gotcha.
Then you've got volume discounts.
Okay.
Those can be a bit trickier.
Okay. How so?
Well, if the discount is applied at the end of the year,
Mm-hmm.
you might need to adjust the GST-HST later on.
I could see how that could get complicated,
Yeah.
especially if you're dealing with
Yeah.
a lot of transactions.
Lots of moving parts
If-
throughout the year.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This really highlights the importance of accurate record keeping.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be able to justify your calculations
Right.
and show that you're following the rules
Yeah.
just in case the CRA comes knocking.
Good point. I'm starting to realize that organization is key when it
Yeah.
comes to GST, HST.
Yes.
Now, what about trade-ins?
Okay.
Those are pretty common in certain industries.
They are. The rules for trade-ins
Yeah.
depend on whether the person trading in the item
Okay.
is also required to charge GST, HST.
Okay.
So, for example,
If a business trades in a piece of equipment,
right,
the rules are different than if an individual
Right.
trades in their old car.
so the type of trade-in
Exactly.
determines how the GST, HST is calculated.
Yes.
That makes sense. Now, before we move on,
I-
I'm curious about something. We
Mhm.
keep talking about these
Yeah.
specific scenarios and rules.
Yeah.
But what happens when things go wrong?
Okay.
What if a business has a bad debt
Yeah.
or needs to issue a refund?
Well, the document addresses those situations as well.
Okay, good.
Yeah, it outlines procedures for handling bad debts,
Right.
returned goods,
Mm-hmm.
and even selling an entire business.
That's reassuring.
Yeah,
It sounds like they've really thought of everything.
they have.
So let's say a customer just disappears
Okay.
without paying their invoice.
Mm-hmm.
Can the business recover the GST, HST
They can?
they paid on that sale?
Yes. The document explains how to claim
Okay.
a bad debt adjustment. which allows businesses to recover the GST, HST
Right.
paid on uncollectible sales.
Okay. Go
But
ahead.
there are specific conditions that need to be met.
So there's a safety net,
There is.
but it's important to follow the rules
Yes,
to be eligible.
exactly.
What about returned goods?
Okay.
Those must be a headache for retailers,
They can be.
especially around the holidays.
Yeah, especially around the holidays.
Yeah.
But the system is designed to handle those fairly.
Okay.
Typically, a business would issue a credit note
Mm-hmm.
and adjust the GST, HST accordingly.
Okay, so there are processes in place
There are.
for these common issues.
Yes.
What about something more significant,
Okay.
like selling your entire business?
All right.
How does GST, HST factor into that?
Believe it or not,
Okay.
you can sometimes elect to have no GST, HST payable
Oh, really?
on the sale of a business.
That's a pretty big incentive.
It is, but there are specific conditions
Okay.
that need to be met.
I'm guessing those conditions are outlined in the document.
Absolutely. The document provides detailed guidance
Yeah.
on how to qualify for this election.
Okay.
It's a great example of how understanding the rules
Right.
can lead to significant benefits.
It seems like this document is really a gold mine
It is.
of information for businesses.
It is.
But it's also pretty dense.
Yeah.
What are some key takeaways we
Oh.
should highlight for our listeners?
One of the most important things is understanding when you need to register
Right.
for GST, HST. We've talked about revenue thresholds
Yeah.
and the concept of taxable supplies.
Yeah.
Knowing those basics is crucial
Yeah.
for any business.
And even if you don't have to register,
Right.
there might be advantages to doing so
Yes,
because of input tax credits.
exactly.
We've seen how ITCs can help businesses recover
Mm-hmm.
the GST, HST they pay on expenses.
Exactly.
And we've also explored some of the nuances
Yeah.
of price adjustments.
Right.
It's like discounts and trade-ins.
Mhm.
It's important to understand
Yeah.
how those impact your GST, HST calculations.
Well, absolutely.
We've also learned that the CRA has systems in place
Yes.
for handling situations like bad debts
Mhm.
and returned goods.
Yep.
It's reassuring to know there are processes
It is.
for dealing with these common business challenges.
Absolutely.
Now let's shift our focus to another
Okay.
important aspect of GST, HST,
You're right.
filing your returns.
Okay.
It might not be the most exciting topic,
No.
but it's essential for compliance.
It is.
Filing returns, I have to admit,
Yeah.
that part doesn't exactly fill me with joy.
I understand. But the document actually makes it less intimidating
No,
than you might think.
Right.
It explains the different filing methods,
Okay.
deadlines,
Yeah.
and everything you need to know
Right.
to stay on the right side of the CRA.
Okay. So what are the basics
Yeah.
of filing a GST, HST return?
Yeah.
How often do you have to do it?
That depends on your reporting period,
Okay.
which is determined by your revenue from
Right.
taxable supplies.
Yeah.
Most businesses start with an annual reporting period,
Okay.
meaning they file once a year.
Once a year.
But if your revenue exceeds certain thresholds,
Right.
you'll need to file more frequently,
Okay.
either quarterly
Okay.
or even monthly.
So the more you make,
It's a trade-off.
the more paperwork you have to deal with.
Yeah.
It's a trade-off, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess so.
But I'm guessing there are different ways
You're right.
to actually file those returns.
There are. The document highlights various methods
Okay, like what?
online through my business account, by phone, using telefile, and even the old-fashioned paper method.
Oh, well, people still do that.
Some people do. But here's a key point.
Okay.
As of January 1st, 2024,
Okay.
electronic filing became mandatory
Oh, wow.
for almost all GST, HST registrants.
So no more paper filing for most businesses.
Not for most, no.
That's a pretty big change.
It is a big change,
Yeah.
but it makes things much more efficient.
Right.
Faster processing,
Right.
fewer errors,
Right.
less paper waste.
Right.
It's a win-win for everyone.
I'm all for efficiency,
Me too.
especially when it comes to taxes.
Absolutely.
But let's be real.
Okay.
Mistakes happen.
They do.
What if you mess something up
Yeah,
on your return
right.
or miss a deadline?
The document does outline penalties for late filing or incorrect information. Right. However, it also mentions something called the Voluntary Disclosures Program.
Voluntary Disclosures Program.
Yes.
That sounds interesting.
It is. It's a bit like a safety net
Okay.
for honest mistakes.
Okay. Tell me more.
Basically, if you've made an honest mistake
Good.
or omission on your tax filings,
Mm-hmm.
you can voluntarily disclose it to the CRA.
Okay.
They may then waive or reduce any penalties.
So it's like a second chance to do the right
Exactly.
thing.
Exactly.
That's good to know.
It is.
Now, before we wrap up this filing discussion, I want to circle back to input tax credits.
Oh, right.
We talked about them earlier,
We did.
but I'm curious about the actual claiming process.
That's an important part of the equation.
Yeah.
The document goes into quite a bit of detail about ITCs.
Okay.
And it's important to understand the nuances first and foremost.
Okay.
The expenses you're claiming
Yeah.
must be reasonable for your business.
Okay, so no writing off lavish vacations as business development expenses.
Exactly. And here's another crucial point.
Okay.
You can only claim ITCs
Yeah.
for the portion of an expense that's actually used for your business activities.
Right.
So if you use your car
Right.
for both business and personal use,
Mm-hmm.
you can only claim a portion of the GST HST you paid on things like gas and repairs.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's all about being accurate
It is.
and transparent with your expenses.
Exactly.
What if I use something almost exclusively for business, like 90% or more?
In those cases, you can typically claim the full ITC,
Okay.
but the document also outlines specific situations where there are restrictions on ITCs,
Okay. Like what?
like meals and entertainment expenses.
Yes, the classic whining and dining client's dilemma.
Exactly.
It's always a bit of a gray area.
It can be, but the document clarifies that you can generally only claim 50% of the GST HST you paid on those types of expenses.
Okay.
However, there are exceptions for certain professions, like long-haul truck drivers. They have specific allowances. And interestingly, charities and public institutions can actually claim 100% of eligible meal and entertainment expenses.
Interesting. So sometimes it pays to be charitable.
It does.
At least from a tax perspective.
Yeah.
Now, is there anything else?
The most important thing is to keep meticulous records.
Okay.
You need proper documentation to
Right.
support your claims. So keep those receipts and invoices organized.
I'm sensing a theme here.
Yeah.
Stay organized.
Yeah.
Keep good records. And don't try to pull a fast one on the CRA.
Don't they have ways of finding out?
They always do.
They do.
So we've covered filing, payments, and ITCs.
Right.
What other essential aspects of GST HST are hidden in this treasure trove of a document?
One area that often causes confusion is the concept of place of supply.
Place of supply.
It basically determines where a transaction is deemed to take place for GST HST purposes, which can impact the applicable tax rate.
Okay, so if I sell something online to someone in another province, where does that sale actually occur?
That's a great example.
Yeah.
The document has specific rules
Okay.
for determining the place of supply for both goods and services.
Okay.
For tangible goods,
Right.
it's usually based on where the goods are delivered or made available to the buyer.
Oh, yeah.
For services, it can get a bit more complex,
All right.
but the document provides clear examples and scenarios.
Okay, so location is key.
Location is key.
But what about digital products?
Okay.
Like ebooks, online courses, and software downloads?
Right.
Those can be accessed anywhere.
They can.
How does the CRA handle those?
The document has a dedicated section
Okay.
on intangible personal property,
Okay.
or IPP,
Okay.
which covers those digital products.
Okay.
The rules for determining the place of supply for IPP can be complex and often depend on the buyer's location and where the supplier is registered.
So the CRA has caught up with the digital age
They have.
when it comes to GST, HST.
Yeah.
But what about those situations where someone buys something in one province and brings it into another province with a different HST rate? Do they have to pay extra tax?
They might.
Really?
That's called self-assessing.
So self-assessing.
And the document outlines when and how to do it.
Okay.
It applies to both goods and services.
Wow.
And there are even specific rules for motor vehicles.
So I can't even escape the tax man when I'm on a road trip.
Not quite. There are exceptions, of course.
Okay.
For example, if you're a GST HST registrant and you bring something into another province for use in your business, you generally don't have to self-assess.
Okay.
The document goes into detail about those exceptions.
Okay, so it's all about understanding the rules.
It is.
And knowing when they apply
Yeah.
to your specific situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm starting to see the logic behind the system, even though it can be a bit overwhelming at times.
It can be.
Yeah.
You've got it. And while we've only scratched the surface of the Canadian GST HST system,
this deep dive has already provided some foundational knowledge and key terms to help you navigate this complex area. Now let's move on to some of the more unique situations.
Unique situations.
Yeah.
That sounds intriguing.
Yeah.
What do you have in mind?
Well, I was thinking about those little details.
Okay.
You wouldn't necessarily think they have tax implications.
Right.
For example, the document has a whole section on returnable beverage containers.
You mean those deposit bottles and cans?
Exactly.
I never would have thought about GST, HST applying to those.
It's a great example of how detailed the Canadian tax system can be.
So how does that work?
Essentially, the GST, HST only applies to the non-refundable portion of the deposit.
Okay.
So if you buy a bottle with a 10-cent deposit, and 5 cents of that is refundable, only the remaining 5 cents
would be subject to GST, HST.
So it's all about separating the refundable portion from the actual price of the beverage. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Are there any other situations where this kind of breakdown is important?
Another example is when a customer puts down a deposit to reserve an item, the GST, HST isn't charged on the deposit itself, only when it's applied to the final purchase price.
Gotcha. So deposits have their own set of rules.
They do. What about those situations where someone is selling goods or services on behalf of someone else?
Okay, yeah. Like
an auctioneer.
Right, an auctioneer.
Or a consignment shop.
Right.
Who's responsible for the GST, HST then?
Yeah, that's a good question.
The document outlines specific scenarios for those selling for others situations. For auctioneers, it's pretty straightforward. They're generally considered the supplier and are required to charge and remit the GST, HST.
Regardless
of whether the person they're selling for is registered.
So even if I'm just auctioning off some old furniture?
Technically, yes.
Okay.
The auctioneer would handle the tax in that scenario.
Okay.
But there is a potential workaround.
Okay.
If both the auctioneer and the seller are registered, they can jointly elect to have the owner of the goods account for the GST, HST instead.
So there's some built-in flexibility.
There is.
If both parties are registered.
Exactly.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
What about those consignment situations?
Consignment can be a bit more complex. It really comes down to whether the consignor, the person providing the goods, is a GST, HST registrant.
Okay.
If they are, they're responsible for charging GST, HST on the sale to the consignment shop.
Right.
If they're not registered, then the consignment shop becomes responsible for charging GST, HST. When they sell the goods to the final customer.
So it all boils down to who in the chain is registered.
Yes.
And therefore responsible for collecting the tax.
Exactly. It seems like there's a rule for just about everything in this document.
Yeah.
There are a lot of specific situations covered.
Yeah.
But it's all about creating a fair and consistent system. For instance, there are even specific rules for industries like direct selling, where independent sales representatives sell products directly to consumers.
Okay. I'm starting to feel like I could handle any GST, HST situation that comes my way.
Maybe not quite yet.
Okay.
But you've certainly gained a solid understanding of the basics.
Well, this deep dive has been incredibly insightful.
It has been.
We've covered so much ground, from who needs to register to how to handle those unique situations that most people wouldn't even consider.
Exactly. And we've highlighted the importance of understanding key concepts like input tax credits and the place of supply rules.
But most importantly, I think we've demystified the GST, HST system.
Yeah.
And shown that it's not as intimidating as it might seem at first glance.
Exactly. It's all about having the right information and knowing where to find it.
So to our listeners,
we
encourage you to take this knowledge and apply it to your own circumstances.
Absolutely.
Whether you're running a business, making a major purchase, or just curious about how the Canadian tax system works. This information can empower you to make informed decisions.
Absolutely.
And remember, that handy government document is always there if you need to dig deeper into a specific topic.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes, thank you.
Into the world of Canadian GST HST.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.
See you next time.
Happy filing.